You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and really the last week of 2021. It has, of course, been an incredible year, and we're looking forward to 2022, but we'll spend probably a little bit of time today talking about COVID. Let me just for a minute also encourage those of you that like to take some notes, grab something to write with, because I'm going to give you some numbers, and sometimes the numbers won't match, because I'll give you some numbers for the number of COVID cases or even the number of deaths for yesterday. Later I'm going to be reading one from Sunday, so the numbers are a little bit different from day to day, but it will still give you a little bit of a sense. And what I want to do is, now people for the first time are starting to acknowledge something we have been talking about for about a week, and that is, I just sort of said offhandedly the other day, you know, there's still about 1,000 people every day that die with or because of COVID-19. And even after the break, I had some people saying, are you sure about that? And I said, yes, and I'll give you those numbers in just a minute. And the point I was making is that you wouldn't hear about that. Remember when we had the drumbeat in 2020 every single day? And then, of course, everybody started speculating, well, why aren't we hearing about that now from the media? And the bottom line is that we actually have a situation in which what has probably taken place is that we don't want this to be looking like we want to blame Joe Biden. Okay, we understand that. We also maybe think that there is a fatigue factor. That's probably true as well. But I'll give you those numbers in just a minute. I'm thinking we might be able to connect up with our lawyer, who is the author of the first article, When a President's Impatience Supersedes Freedom. So we might get to them a little bit later, but it is our first article in which, you know, you might remember the president said that he was his patience was wearing thin with Americans who had opted out of vaccination. I'm going to get into that in just a minute. And that gave him justification, he thought, to actually have OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, impose a national vaccine mandate. Hasn't worked out so well in the courts, although the Sixth Circuit Court, in its wisdom, and I put that in quotes, thinks that maybe it should be implemented. But it is a very good piece by Luke Wade. We might get with him a little bit later, in which he points out that that is a good example of where we have simply allowed presidents to have authority and power that was never granted either by the Constitution and the founders or even by Congress. And if you think he's going to just be beating up just on one president, he then talks about two of the previous presidents, President Trump and President Obama. So, I mean, there are good examples of how, in some respects, if a president these days feels like Congress isn't going to do the right thing, well, then I'll get my pen and my phone. You might remember that from President Obama, and begin to do some things which, quite frankly, I know are unconstitutional, but maybe I can get away with it anyway. And so this is the sad state of affairs we find ourselves in. So I will postpone that conversation, although it's the first article. If we don't have a chance to talk with Luke Wade, who is with the Pacific Legal Foundation, then I tell you what, we will get into that in more detail. Let's give you the numbers. And again, I want to give credit to a couple of people. You know, everything from the Drudge Report to, of course, Johns Hopkins Center has reminded us that we are still in the midst of this. There's some that are saying, well, it's just an attempt to spread fear. Well, I certainly agree with that. But, I mean, just facts are facts, and let's do a comparison. Yesterday was December 27th. Let's compare where we were on December 27th a year ago. And December 27th, 2020, the number of COVID cases, if you want to write this down, 152,000. The actual number is 152,089. So that was a year ago, 152,000 COVID cases in America. What was it yesterday? 543,415. So from 152,000 to 543,000. You can kind of see that up until recently, the media hadn't really even tried to cover this. Now, these cases are, to be fair, Omicron, which tends to be lighter, but it still is an illustration of the fact that the number of cases compared to where we were this time last year is on the border of almost 4 times as much. So you can begin to see that's significant. So that's COVID cases, 152,000 to 543,000. What about deaths? That was the point I made about a week ago, in which you've almost had a media blackout to talk about this. Well, again, let's go back to December 27th. 2020, a year ago. The number of deaths, and again, I recognize sometimes people are putting this down because of COVID, with COVID, all that. So we recognize that these numbers oftentimes may be inflated. I understand that, but nevertheless, these are the numbers if you want to do an apples-to-apples comparison. And December 27th, last year at 2020, 1,230. So 1,200 people died a year ago yesterday. How many died today or yesterday? 1,737. So we really are talking about, again, an increase in the number of cases and also an increase in the number of deaths. Not necessarily arguing for the vaccine mandate, not necessarily saying that we shouldn't have it, although I think there are some real good constitutional issues, which we'll talk about with Luke Wake about that. But it illustrates exactly where we find ourselves right now. It also, I think, illustrates another point if you look at our third article that we've posted, and that is, why again is the press not covering this? Well, it turns out that nearly half of all the COVID-19 cases are in one state, New York State. Which is a blue state. Now, you can imagine the actual number is 45%, but 45% of all the new COVID-19 cases are found in one state. The other 55% in the other 49 states. So you can kind of see that. Now, let me just ask you a hypothetical question. If 45% of the new cases were in Florida, do you think they might have said something about how irresponsible Governor Ron DeSantis was? And the answer is, of course they would. If 45% of the new COVID-19 cases were in the state of Texas, do you think they might have said how irresponsible Greg Abbott was? But, of course, we have a new governor there, and maybe, of course, one, because she's new in the position, and two, because it's New York. It's a point that's really worth talking about. And one other point I might just mention is that we also have been seeing those numbers tick up over time. We have 50 million COVID cases around the world. Actually in the United States, I should say, and 800,000 deaths since the pandemic began. A little bit later, we're going to be quoting from some very good pieces by Victor Davis Hanson, but it's a reminder that there has been just a real attempt to sort of downplay some of this during the Biden administration. But let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the constitutional issues involved with that. The first article we've posted is by Luke Wake. It is something that was in The Hill, and he is with the Pacific Legal Foundation. We'll get into that. It has the title, When a President's Impatience Supersedes Freedom, and we'll talk with him about that. And then we'll get back into some of the guidance, because now you're starting to have the CDC suggesting that if you haven't had your booster, you're going to be treated as if you're unvaccinated. And Israel's now even talking about a fourth booster. It's just amazing. So we'll get into all those issues right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Big government isn't working, according to Newt Gingrich, but he doesn't ask you to accept his conclusion, but encourages you to check it out for yourself. Here are his suggestions. Go to the local gas station and ask folks filling up their gas tanks if they think things are working. Go to the grocery store and watch people coping with the rising cost of food and ask if they think things are working. Go to small businesses whose shipments are still hung up on container ships anchored off of Long Beach and ask them if they think things are working. He gives other examples, including some of the sobering statistics about crime. Each of these examples illustrates why more Americans are convinced that big government is failing. He refers to that as big government socialism because a recent national survey found that a majority of Americans describe the current administration as big government socialism. He also adds that this passion for total control fits the warnings of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, and Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Several people I know have decided to go back and read some of these books. So if you're wondering how to communicate these ideas to your children or grandchildren, he suggests you watch the film The Grasshopper and the Ants, based on the Aesop fable that describes two different approaches to life. The ants work constantly storing up food. The grasshopper enjoys life. He thinks hard work is a waste of time and makes fun of the ants. When winter approaches, the grasshopper nearly starves to death, but is saved by the generosity of the ants. This is a lesson we should teach our children. Come to think of it, perhaps it's also a lesson we should teach to some of our politicians. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
First article on our website today at pointofview.net is When a President's Impatient Supersedes Freedom. It came out in The Hill, and oftentimes I tend to read some of these on the air, but I was informed by our friends at Pacific Legal Foundation that Luke Wake, who wrote it, would be available for an interview, so we decided to postpone reading it on air and post it, and he is with an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation, focusing on things like the separation of powers and individual liberty and the rest. Before working with them, he was with the Small Business Legal Center, and as a graduate also of Elon University in North Carolina and Case Western Reserve School of Law in Cleveland, Ohio. And Luke, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's get to the comment that the president made, which is what started this, that the president said his patience was wearing thin, which is why then he did something which I think in his heart of hearts, and certainly many of the people around him knew could not be done, and that is to tell OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that instead of just looking at toxic wastes and asbestos and all sorts of things that might be a hazard in occupations, that could now be extended to actually require a national vaccine mandate. And as frustrated as that president might be, or any president in the past might be, that doesn't justify taking over something that neither the framers nor the Constitution nor Congress allowed people to do in the first place. What are your thoughts?
Well, we have a rule of law. We have a constitution to protect our liberties and to protect us against government overreach. And that only works insofar as we adhere to it. But the problem is that, for decades, really, I mean, you look back to the New Deal era and forward, the Supreme Court and the federal courts have been allowed the federal government, the federal agencies that micromanage our economy and our lives in many instances, to grow more and more powerful by giving a great deal of deference to these agencies as they take the words that Congress writes in statutes and they stretch them to accomplish all sorts of ends that such that whenever you have a president who's bent on accomplishing some sort of end, he can usually tell his lawyers, go out and find a way to make this happen. And, this isn't totally a Democrat issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's both parties have done this. I give some examples in my piece, but consistently trying to reach beyond the actual authority that Congress has given them, because the agencies, they only have the power that Congress gives them by law in the statutes that they pass. They don't have free-floating authority to do what they want, even if they think it's a good thing to do. They've got to be able to point to the text in the statute. And the thing is, if they can stretch that statute to get away with it and the courts defer to them, well, then you just see this growing behemoth of a government.
Well, let's, if we can, talk about the fact that these happened on both ends with some of the presidents that really wanted to use their power. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, New Deal, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Great Society program, and even more recently, you give examples of Donald Trump and especially Barack Obama, where I think some of this really got started with the pen and the phone. That is certainly part of it. But the other part of it, Luke, is the fact that Congress is all too willing to delegate that authority either to the executive branch and an unelected bureaucrat or to unelected judges for life, because you can look at some of these statutes. The OSHA statute is not one of those, but the Affordable Care Act, a good example, Obamacare, where time after time it said, as the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall determine. So it basically said, we're not going to try to figure all this out. We'll let you go figure it out. And then, of course, we won't take any blame for anything that blows up in our faces. So part of the problem is the executive branch wants the power, but the other problem is the legislative branch is all too willing to give it. Fair?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I've written about that as well. The issue is, Congress likes to take credit for doing something, and yet not making any hard decisions. When it comes to the hard decisions, the actual meaning for where the rubber hits the road, as they would say, they like to punt. They like to write in vague, ambiguous language and let the EPA or the Department of Labor figure out how in practice we're going to actually construe those language. And so they give them charges in the statutory text that can be construed basically in many cases saying, well, go do whatever you think is in the public interest. I don't think there's a better example of that than the Public Health Service Act from the 1940s, which the CDC was using to justify its nationwide eviction moratorium for almost a year. Ultimately, the courts agreed with us that CDC was misconstruing the statute. They were honing in on just a particular part of it and ignoring the rest. Where read in context, their authority was actually quite limited. But they were focused on just this one phrase that said that the CDC director could do anything that she deemed necessary to control the pandemic. And, again, that's if we construe it like that, that's a blank check authority for the government, for this federal agency to basically make law. And that's one of the reasons why it shouldn't have been construed that way. And we ultimately, again, prevailed on that. But there's a lot of these examples out there with you have, again, nebulous language, and the agency will construe that as a blank check to do whatever it wants to write the law. And that's just not the way our system is supposed to be.
Let me just mention that we do have a link to Pacific Legal Foundation. It's pacificlegal.org. You can find some of the material there. We've also have information about Luke and his background, as well as we, of course, also have this piece, When the President's Impatience Supersedes Freedom. And to be fair, just a minute ago, what you were talking about was something that happened under President Trump, because in this particular case, just really an attempt to bypass Congress and simply say, so the Centers for Disease Control have the ability to actually begin to have a moratorium on evictions.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the Biden administration continued that even after there were strong signals from the courts that they didn't have statutory authority. Talk about the breakdown and separation of powers. You actually had Congress folks, Nancy Pelosi and so forth, protesting on the Senate Capitol, the Capitol steps, saying, boy, we want the executive branch to take unilateral action, even though the courts have signaled that they don't have authority. I mean, that really speaks to how far gone we are in our separation of powers.
I think I'll let you get on to some of your family activities, but I did want to thank you for taking just a few minutes with us today. And most importantly, I would encourage people to read. This goes on for a couple of pages and really helps us understand that what we are dealing with is an action by the president, which was then struck down in almost every court. Then you all of a sudden got to the Sixth Circuit Court, which said, well, I guess, this whole idea of toxic substance or agents that are physically harmful, maybe that could be applied to the whole issue of pandemic, and just a good illustration. And again, I thank you for joining us. And again, the article is on the website. We also have a very good link to the Pacific Legal Institute, and a lot of great material. So let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into a couple of other issues. And one of those, of course, is back to this issue of the pandemic. And in addition, we have a very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, where even as you start reading, you might think, well, he's only talking about COVID. Actually, before he's done, he talks about all sorts of other examples of where we sometimes see the danger and the reality from a biblical point of view of sowing and reaping. And the reason for us to really begin to watch ourselves in terms of hubris. I think there has been too much arrogance, too many claims being made about COVID-19 or a variety of other issues we're going to get into that remind us that there are some biblical admonitions about humility and maybe to watch out against pride and hubris. But as we go to our break, let me real quickly encourage you to go to our website, and you can, of course, find this first article here by Luke Wade, and also we, a little bit later, will be talking with our good friend Michael Rydelnik in the next hour, 50 most important Bible questions. I love to get away from some of the issues in the news and come back and do what we can to encourage biblical literacy. So I think you really will enjoy that. These are some of the questions he has received as the host of Open Line on the Moody Broadcasting Network. And so we're going to take on a few of those and give you a chance at the end, if you'd like to ask some questions that aren't in the book. We certainly will give you that opportunity. But as you go to the website, once again, we are coming to the last few days of 2021. We are dependent upon your financial support for these kinds of programs. And so if you can help us out, please go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that button that says donate. Or if you'd like to talk to someone off air, that number is 800-347-5151. As I've mentioned before, we do have a match on the table. That means your gift is doubled. $10 becomes $20, $100 becomes $200, $500 becomes $1,000. And that match is still available as long as it lasts. So if you can help us out, you might want to make that phone call or visit the website, pointofview.net. Click on that button, and we'll be right back.
Sometimes the daily news is flat out confusing, depressing. In fact, it's dark. In the chaos, Americans are searching for a light. They want the unfiltered truth in language they can understand. The psalmist pointed us to the answer. He said, "For it is you, God, who lights my lamp. The Lord, my God, lightens my darkness." At Point of View, we carry the torch of God's truth every day. With the Bible as our guiding light, we help listeners navigate the confusing time in which we live. And when you give generously, you are like a beacon of light for people searching for sound, credible truth. And now, It's up to you. December 31st is our deadline for the incredible matching challenge of $85,000. Your gift today has twice the impact. Everyone needs the light. Please give generously on or before December 31st at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. That's 800-347-5151 or online at pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, it is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and if you would like to join us, I'd love to hear from you, 1-800-351-1212. There are all sorts of things that oftentimes go on behind the scenes, and I never mention them, but I figured it'd probably be worth mentioning the fact that anybody that ever once in a while asks me, is this live? I go, don't you know it's live? Yes, it is a live show. And we figured that out. You probably figured that out. It turns out that Luke didn't realize that when we wanted him on at 1 o'clock Central Time, he thought that was 1 o'clock Pacific Time, so he wasn't ready for another 2 hours to do the interview. Sounds like we caught him at home and with the child. So that happens from time to time. And we love children, and sometimes we've had children crying in the background, dogs barking in the background. And anytime you wonder, is it live? Yes, it is live. Anyway, let's get back to a lot of issues in the news, because I wanted to educate you a little bit more on some of the things coming down from the CDC. Then we want to get into our two E's. One is economics. The other is education. And some very important things happened just recently that you need to know about. But let's talk about the CDC, and that is the Centers for Disease Control have put together their quarantine guidelines. Now, if you've been paying attention, you will notice that they've changed the quarantine from 10 days to 5 days. But if you read the fine print, you see something else. And this is what we've been warning on Point of View for some time. I don't claim to be an Old Testament prophet or the son of a prophet, but we saw this coming, and that is, it's very clear now that the CDC is starting to treat anybody who has not gotten a booster. Forget whether or not you got the 2 shots of Moderna or Pfizer or the 1 shot of Johnson & Johnson. If you don't have your booster, we're going to treat you as if you're unvaccinated. You might say, okay, Kerby, you better prove this to me. Okay, I'm reading directly from the CDC, okay? Quote, for people who are unvaccinated or more than 6 months out from their second mRNA dose or more than 2 months after their Johnson & Johnson vaccine and are not yet boosted, the Centers for Disease Control now recommends quarantine for 5 days, followed by strict mask use for an additional 5 days. Alternatively, if a 5-day quarantine is not feasible, it is imperative that an exposed person wear a well-fitting mask at all times when around others for 10 days after exposure. Individuals who have received their booster shot do not need to quarantine following an exposure, but should wear a mask for 10 days after the exposure. So the message, as far as I can read through all the bureaucraties, is this. If you are vaccinated but unboosted, we're going to treat you the very same way as somebody who has never been vaccinated in the first place. Isn't that how you read it? That's how I read it. And one of these articles that came out recently said, it was kind of interesting when the Florida governor, that would be Ron DeSantis, even predicted that the various vaccine mandates that we were just talking about a minute ago with Luke Wake would apply to people who are vaccinated and not boosted. Did you see the amount of, and I could think of other words, but we'll call it grief, that came down on his head? The number of fact checkers who slammed him unmercifully for saying that. And yet here now, a couple of weeks later, Anthony Fauci, Dr. Fauci, conceded that the change to this idea of an unboosted person is the same as an unvaccinated person. He said it's only a matter of when, not if. There's a good link to it if you want to find it, but I think you get the point. So we've been saying this for some time and shouldn't be necessarily surprised by it. One of the commentators here said, this is not just an arbitrary semantic game. An executive order issued by the president, right, which is now, because of the Sixth Circuit, supposed to be in process and in place, forces larger employers to require employees to get either fully vaccinated or tested regularly. If your definition of fully vaccinated is 2 shots and a third, guess what? Then you are vaccinated. But if you have 2 shots and not a third, you're not vaccinated. And so, again, requiring people to be vaccinated and now boosted every 6 months or so, as some people have pointed out, seems almost unprecedented and was not what was sold to us at the beginning. Would you agree? Now, maybe you have some thoughts about it, agree or disagree. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But nevertheless, it seems to me that the Centers for Disease Control is inching closer to that. Now, here's something very interesting, because we've been watching Israel. As you know, in the past, we've tried to have and been fortunate to have a couple of trips to Israel, but the chances of getting to Israel anytime soon seem to be kind of slim and none. Hate to tell that to some of the people that keep trying to postpone their trips from December to March and all those kinds of things. But here in Jerusalem, this comes from a day or two ago, the panel of experts in the Israeli government are now recommending and recommended just before Christmas that everybody in Israel now should get a fourth dose. Are you counting here? We got 1 and 2, because most of them use Pfizer there in Israel, but I think some have Moderna and some others and AstraZeneca, but most of them have Pfizer. They get 2. They've had a third. Now they're talking about a fourth dose. A fourth dose, or a second boost, however you want to say that. Now, fortunately, in this particular article, it illustrates that maybe common sense is breaking out all over the place, because the second paragraph says, but some scientists warn that the plan could backfire because too many shots might cause a sort of immune system fatigue, compromising the body's ability to fight the coronavirus. A few members of the government's advisory panel raised that concern with respect to the elderly, according to a written summary of the discussion that was obtained by the New York Times. So you would think that people saying, this could cause what's called immune system fatigue. But nevertheless, the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, said, yep, we're going to get everybody to get a fourth shot anyway. So I appreciate the common sense on the part of those individuals that find themselves actually speaking to that issue, but it didn't work very well. And one other point I might make real quickly is Joe Biden was on a call the other day with the governors. You have what is called the National Governors Association, and you had a couple of these Republican governors, one of them, Governor Asa Hutchinson, who basically was saying that, we don't want the federal government to come in with certain statements that are going to be counterproductive to what we do in a state. And that's where, for the first time, you've had President Biden say, well, there is no federal solution. That gets solved at the state level. A little bit later, he also talked about another governor. That would be Governor Sununu up there in New Hampshire. And he said he talks a lot about this, and ultimately it gets down where the rubber meets the road, and that's where the patient is in need of help or in the need for help. So there was an acknowledgement, maybe a rather weak acknowledgement, that maybe this idea of a nationwide one-size-fits-all federal mandate is not a good idea. I wish he'd thought about that before he mandated that, but that's where we find ourselves right now. Let's take a break, but just before we do so, let me mention that I have a couple of commentaries. One is yesterday. I didn't really get into it very much, but it was entitled Economic Cheerleaders. And the fact is that if you're really paying attention to the amount of money printing that's been taking place, the amount of inflation that's been taking place, the fact that even if you use the CPI, Consumer Price Index, which I think is lower than it should be, even if you use that number, we have inflation that hasn't been this high since 1982. If you use numbers which are based on what we used to use in a very fixed basket of goods back in 1980 rather than this variable one now, it would be probably the worst inflation we've seen in a generation. But nevertheless, you have cheerleaders telling us that, the economy's in good shape, actually inflation's good for you, and the attempt I have here is to explain that, there are some people that might benefit from inflation. That would be the federal government, because it gets to pay back its national debt, if it ever does, with inflated dollars. And if you're in debt, maybe that's a good thing for you, because then when you have to pay your mortgage or your debt, you're paying it back back with inflated dollars, but it's terrible for just about everyone else, especially if you're on a fixed income, because your wages, for example, just never go up as fast or as high as they do with the inflation rate. And so my commentary today is entitled Big Government Isn't Working, and that is a piece that was actually put together by Newt Gingrich, in which he simply says, look, you don't have to believe me or the economists. He says just go to a local gas station, ask people filling up their gas tanks if they think things are working. Go to the grocery store and watch people coping with the rising cost of food and ask if they think things are working. Or go to small businesses whose shipments are still hung up on container ships off of Long Beach and ask them if they think those things are working. And I think you'd know what the answer is to all of those. So it's a piece to, once again, have you recognize that if you just use a little bit of intelligence, a little bit of common sense, and you just look around you, you recognize that people are trying to tell you it's all just fine. And the reality is there's a real need to begin to think next year about electing the right people, at least into Congress and the state legislatures and in governors, just to make right decisions. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Time for a few more minutes, and top of the hour, then we're going to spend some time with Michael Rydelnik talking about his book, 50 Most Important Bible Questions, some of the ones that have been probably some of the more difficult questions that he's received over the years as the host of Open Line on the Moody Broadcasting Network, put those into a book, and I think those are helpful because from time to time you get talking to individuals, maybe you're witnessing to somebody and they raise a question, you go, I wonder if there's an answer for that. And the answer is there is. And so we're going to help you understand how to be more effective in that regard. Just before I get to my piece by Victor Davis Hanson, which is one of the articles we've posted, I thought I'd mention something real quickly that Gary Bauer mentioned in his end of day report. And we'll talk with him tomorrow about that. So if you'll be listening in, we are privileged to have everybody from Kelly Shackelford to Congressman Van Taylor to Gary Bauer on the program. It's going to be quite a program tomorrow. But he pointed out that over the weekend, Chuck Todd was doing an interview with Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the creator of the 1619 Project. You should be familiar with that, but if you're not, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. I just typed in 1619 Project, found 17 different articles. Some of those are my commentaries. Some of those are articles that have been posted by others about the 1619 Project. All you really need to know is that even secular historians who wouldn't agree with us from a biblical point of view still say that this is really a flawed history. The argument that America started in 1690 when the first slaves were actually brought to Jamestown. Didn't start in 1620 with the Pilgrims, didn't start in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, didn't start in 1789 with the Constitution. No, it starts then. And then all sorts of just unbelievably historically inaccurate things like that the reason the American Revolution was fought was in order to maintain slavery, which is factually incorrect. Matter of fact, the first draft of the Declaration actually wants to abolish slavery. Interesting enough, in the slave trade, it was taken out because of the pressure brought on Thomas Jefferson by some of the delegates from, I think it was Georgia and South Carolina. But anyway, you would think that Chuck Todd would be talking about those various historical inaccuracies, but nevertheless still wanted to know, what about the fact that people don't want people to be and teachers to teach this in the schools, which led to Nicole Hannah-Jones to saying, I really don't understand this idea that parents should decide what's being taught. I'm not a professional educator. I don't have a degree in social studies or science. And then she went on to say, when the candidate, that'd be Democrat Terry McAuliffe, said that he didn't think parents should be deciding what's taught in school, he was panned for that. But that's just a fact. I think we should leave that to the educators. And then went on to a rant about the fact that our society is veering towards authoritarianism. You might want to ask a follow-up question, given the fact that the people in power right now are in one particular party. Are you saying that that's what's going on? And anyway, it was really hard to imagine, but part of it was just the complete unwillingness to recognize that the teaching of things like critical race theory, the teaching of very blatant sexuality in sex education programs, the demand for masks, even for children that are very young age, and all of this weren't necessarily the reason for the defeat of a Democratic candidate in Virginia. It's just, again, an unwillingness to look at the facts. I think there's going to be a real surprise for some of these individuals that are living in their own sort of isolated view of the world. But nevertheless, we'll probably chat about that tomorrow, because you are starting to see more and more people doubling down by saying, you parents have no right to tell us what we can or can't teach in the schools. And I recognize that ultimately we do have to leave the teaching to the teachers. But to suggest that parents can't speak out at school boards, and when they do, we're going to have to designate them as domestic terrorists. If you don't see a backlash coming in the elections of 2022, I think you haven't been paying attention. But let's end real quickly with a very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, because he reminds us of the fact that sometimes pride goes before the fall, and there's a sowing and a reaping. And he points out, first of all, that when you had the current president as a candidate saying that Donald Trump is responsible for the 200,000 COVID deaths, if the president had done his job, then all people would still be alive. I don't think he'd like it right now if somebody said, well, now that the pandemic has taken over 800,000 lives, should we get rid of you too? And so he spends a little bit of time taking you through the whole issue of the COVID pandemic, but then reminds us, as he says, from the Bible and the Greeks and throughout Western tradition, there is a constant refrain of being wary of hubris, the lying and arrogance that are innate to it, and the divine power that ultimately levels things out. So he moves from there to, some of the political issues issues. For example, did, of course, Joe Biden do a better job with policy on foreign policy, the economy, energy, regulation than Donald Trump? I think the evidence would be probably not. When you start looking at other institutions, he reminds us that the military traditionally almost always polls as one of the most popular institutions in America. The most recent poll shows that only 45% of Americans express trust and confidence in our armed forces, and points out that when you've had various generals smearing the commander-in-chief between 2016 and 2021, what do you expect? And when you have individuals saying that we're not going to focus on Afghanistan or China or Russia, we're going to focus on the issue of white supremacy, you start seeing that, my goodness, you're going to lose a lot of people there as well. And so when people, he says, look for contrition, for apologies, and for explanations, instead they got all sorts of blame. And so when you lose half the country, as a matter of fact, the country, part of the country that used to be supportive of the military, not looking good. He goes on to talk about how the Green New Deal and some of the promotions there have been so unsuccessful, and Black Lives Matter and so much more, and reminds us at the end maybe a principle we should apply. He says, good leaders acknowledge the talent of those they despise. General Patton wasn't real thrilled with General Bernard Montgomery, but he also recognized that he was a good general. Churchill thought that Charles de Gaulle was vain, narcissistic, but he still acknowledged that we wouldn't have been so successful in World War II without Charles de Gaulle. And even Republicans who maybe thought that FDR was vain and treacherous and an egomaniac still rallied around him to recognize that we had to fight World War II. And so there is a lesson here, and it goes on for pages, and it's a lesson we need to teach to our children and our grandchildren, and that is a little more humility would be a good thing. Humility rather than hubris. And as always, Victor Davis Hanson does a great job of explaining that. These are the kinds of things we like to talk about on Point of View, and sometimes we get into the issues of the news. Sometimes we talk about philosophy. Just a few minutes, we're going to talk about the Bible. And I again ask you, where else do you find this kind of diversity and hopefully this kind of depth that goes into these issues? And if you value the kind of information, the commentary, the guests that we bring to the table, can I ask you, just as we go to a break right now, go to our website, which is pointofview.net. You will see that as you go there, that one candle lights another candle, and we want you to be able to light candles in your neighborhood, in your sphere of influence, in your business, in your church, in your family. We want to equip you to be able to do that. And of course, we want to provide those resources, but you can help us with your resources to help fund this ministry. And so as we go to a break, one very good time before you miss out on some of the Bible questions we're going to be answering, you can go to the website at pointofview.net, click on that button that says Donate Now, or you can give us a call on the pledge line number, that is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. There's a match on the table, a dollar-for-dollar match, and we'd love to hear from you. We'll come back and talk about some of these Bible questions right after this.
At Point of View, we are already thinking about our New Year's resolution to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. But we can't accomplish that without your support. And right now, your support is especially critical because whatever you give now through December 31st will be doubled up to $85,000. That means all gifts, whether $10 or $1,000, doubled through December 31st. Did you know Point of View is 100% listener supported? And it's more than just a radio show. Thanks to your support, we offer free tools to help Americans build a Christian worldview in their own lives and live it out in practical ways. Don't miss this opportunity to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. Give by December 31st to have twice the impact. To give today, visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This year we're going to spend some time looking at the Bible, but before we do so, let me just mention that my commentary today, as I mentioned last hour, is Big Government Isn't Working. And that is kind of a phrase that came from Newt Gingrich, because he is actually encouraging you, as I suggested, to check it out yourself. There was a man that used to actually provide political consultation to George Herbert Walker Bush, Lee Atwater. And Lee Atwater sometimes would say, I'll go to a bowling alley and watch and listen to how people talk, just to understand what's in the minds of individuals. And Newt Gingrich has the same idea. Go to a local gas station and ask people filling up their gas tanks if they think things are working. Go to your grocery store and ask people if the rising cost of food, if they think everything's working. Or maybe go to people that are in business and having trouble to get various key parts and things like that. And he says, there are other examples you can use. You can look at the statistics for crime. Also, he talks about the fact that what it all illustrates is that what he calls big government is failing. And he refers to that because the phrase big government socialism actually surfaced in a survey done recently. A majority of Americans, 53%, describe the current administration as big government socialism. Now, they might say, well, that's just the phrase that the people use, or maybe because Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have no problem calling it socialism. But for whatever reason, that phrase and that phraseology is starting to show up a lot in these surveys, which I think tells you a lot about where the American people are moving in that regard. Well, then, Newt Gingrich adds that this passion for total control fits what he calls some of these famous books, and that would be Huxley's Brave New World, or George Orwell's 1984, or Animal Farm, or even Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And I have noticed that a number of people have been actually taking the time to sit down with some of those books and read them, even though many of them are quite old, just to try to get a sense of what is happening around us. But the other part that I appreciate about this, and I mentioned this in my commentary, Newt Gingrich figures out, well, how could we teach some of these ideas to our children and grandchildren? And he suggests you might watch the film The Grasshopper and the Ants, which is really based on that famous Aesop fable, which describes really kind of two different approaches to life. The ants work constantly storing up food. The grasshopper, he sits back and enjoys life. He thinks hard work is a waste of time, even makes fun of the ants. But when winter approaches, the grasshopper nearly starves to death and is saved only by the generosity of the ants. And so he says, maybe that's a lesson we should teach to our children, because it is certainly an important lesson. I suggest in my commentary, maybe it's a lesson we should teach to some of our politicians there as well. Speaking of politicians, again, we're going to have Gary Bauer on tomorrow, but one of the other things I thought we might talk to him about is the Winter Olympics, because the Winter Olympics, which will be part of China, he refers to those as the Genocide Olympics, are scheduled to begin in just a little over a month from now. It should be at least historically, a time of, celebration and competition. But he thinks, and I want to get his comments about that tomorrow, these games would be an atrocity because they end up, in some respects, being a celebration of communist genocide. We have seen how the Olympic Games in the past, I'm thinking of Nazi Germany, have been manipulated and used in a way to advance an agenda. But it was interesting, Gary Bauer points out that in an interview, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he truly regrets that the International Olympic Committee did not move the 2022 Winter Olympic Games out of Beijing, which is the capital of Communist China, because these games, as Gary points out, are a huge propaganda coup for President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, which will certainly not hesitate to take full advantage of the opportunity, highlighting Communist China's power for the world to see. And you're going to see President Xi just front and center there during those games. Communist China, of course, is engaged, if you're not familiar, with a genocide of ethnic Muslims known as Uyghurs. We've talked about this before. Millions of these Uyghurs are imprisoned in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands have been forced into slave labor. And so, as Secretary Mike Pompeo warned, the United States and Communist China basically are on a collision course over Taiwan. And if we can't connect up with Michael Rydelnik, we'll maybe get into some of that in the next segment. But again, Gary Bauer is saying this is not hyperbole. China's state-owned media outlets have been even bragging that the threat of war is real. The Communist China some of the Communist Chinese Party members are threatening to kill our Marines. They're threatening to nuke Japan. There's obviously links to these, so you can read the original article. But yet, and we are in the midst of all of that. Can you believe it? Rewarding them with the Olympic Games. And so it is quite possible that those in China and the leaders in Beijing might actually see this as a reward for the power and influence that they are able to dominate in that corner of the world, and maybe even a vindication of their foreign policy. And a good example of that is to go back to 1936, the Olympic Games in Berlin, Germany. Adolf Hitler front and center. Hitler's Germany was ultimately at war with the world. It was beginning to be more and more obvious every single day as those unfolded. And yet, in the midst of all this, as we've also pointed out on Point of View, and Gary Bauer does as well, corporate America has really turned almost a blind eye to Communist China's gross human rights abuses and threats. You've had some of these major corporations that are actually sponsors of the 2022 Winter Games. Can you imagine that in any other venue? But given the fact that because China is such a major consumer of some of those products, that is why they will be willing to turn a complete blind eye to some of these human rights abuses. And so these woke corporations are oftentimes very quick to attack us in this country when, for example, they want to implement some kind of voter integrity laws because we want free and fair elections, or when we want to defend some of the moral values of some of the people that are standing up for faith and family and freedom and those kinds of things. Yet they can hardly say a word about what is happening right now in Communist China. So, if nothing else, we will spend a little bit of time talking about that tomorrow with Gary Bauer, because I do believe that this is another one of those issues we will be talking about here on Point of View. And it's one of the more reasons for us to encourage you to support us, because if you think you're going to hear any strong criticism of China in the establishment media, well, I've got something else for you, because it's just not happening. But we're willing to speak out to especially address these issues of human rights abuses and the persecution of Christians and the rest. That's what we do here on Point of View. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Big government isn't working, according to Newt Gingrich, but he doesn't ask you to accept his conclusion, but encourages you to check it out for yourself. Here are his suggestions. Go to the local gas station and ask folks filling up their gas tanks if they think things are working. Go to the grocery store and watch people coping with the rising cost of food and ask if they think things are working. Go to small businesses whose shipments are still hung up on container ships anchored off of Long Beach and ask them if they think things are working. He gives other examples, including some of the sobering statistics about crime. Each of these examples illustrates why more Americans are convinced that big government is failing. He refers to that as big government socialism because a recent national survey found that a majority of Americans describe the current administration as big government socialism. He also adds that this passion for total control fits the warnings of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, and Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Several people I know have decided to go back and read some of these books. So if you're wondering how to communicate these ideas to your children or grandchildren, he suggests you watch the film The Grasshopper and the Ants, based on the Aesop fable that describes two different approaches to life. The ants work constantly storing up food. The grasshopper enjoys life. He thinks hard work is a waste of time and makes fun of the ants. When winter approaches, the grasshopper nearly starves to death, but is saved by the generosity of the ants. This is a lesson we should teach our children. Come to think of it, perhaps it's also a lesson we should teach to some of our politicians. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about some of these very important issues. One of those, of course, is the issue of foreign policy. And one of the commentaries that I have coming out in the future is based on something I did read on the air, but it's worth coming back to. And that is, we seem to be headed for the possibility of a military confrontation between the United States and China. My prediction has always been that if indeed China moves on Taiwan, it will be probably after the Winter Olympics. Why would you think they would do it right now when the whole world would be looking at them? But again, I could be wrong, but I think that's probably the more reasonable situation. But at the same time, while you're thinking about the United States and China, you also have to think about the United States and Russia, because after all, there are more Russian troops on the border of Russia and Ukraine than we've seen in some time. And so is it possible that we might actually face a two-front war that we have never faced before in any kind of modern scenario? I mean, even back in World War II, you could say it was a two-front war, but it was on two different theaters of engagement. But okay, that would be the closest thing to anything like that, and even then was probably a little different than what we'd be talking about here. And it's quite possible that in both cases the military action will take place and this president would do nothing. So it's possible that a military confrontation might not take place because we have no stomach for any kind of military engagement. But here's the issue, which has been, I think, very well described by Andrew Mikta. He is the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies, which is at the George Marshall European Center for Security Studies over in Germany. And that is, we have always sort of had the assumption that the reason you might have a conflict between the United States and China is because China is strong. Well, it is in one sense. They have more people in their military than we do. They probably have a more superior navy than we do. But at the same time, the argument by Andrew Mikta is just the opposite. And that is, he says that the tensions may be due to the conviction in both Beijing, China, and Moscow, Russia, that the power advantage that they might have now is going to worsen if they don't take action immediately. In other words, they may have the philosophy it's now or never. And so really the conventional wisdom has been that these countries, especially China, are likely to move against us because they have a perceived strength. But actually, they may actually argue or internally that we may be getting weaker, and so they should strike now for a number of reasons. He gives all those reasons. Let me give you a couple of them because they're pretty intriguing. And that is, first of all, that the United States has really been focused on counterterrorism. And we have. If you look at the way we have been deploying our forces and resources and those kinds of things, first of all, it's being focused a lot of attention on what's oftentimes called asymmetric warfare. And so the restructuring to deal with, for example, a naval battle, which would be certainly the case with China, or a protracted military battle to defend the border of Ukraine, might require a time of restructuring. So it would be possible for China or Russia to catch us while we aren't able to really deploy and project force. So that's one idea. The other argument could be simply that right now the world is pretty much devastated by a lot of things that have taken place. And he talks about what he calls the trifecta. The first is COVID-19. I just, in case you were just joining us, started the show by reminding us that if you compare the number of COVID cases yesterday to a year ago, well, a year ago, the COVID cases were 152,000. Yesterday, 543,000. So almost a fourfold increase in the year. The number of deaths from 1,230 a year ago to 1,737. So we are talking about the fact that a great deal of the country is focused inwardly on dealing with COVID-19. Also, you're talking about the lockdowns and the economic disruption of all of that and the turmoil and the polarization and all the rest. He mentions another in terms of what's happening in the United States and Europe, and that is what he calls increasingly brazen mass migration. We don't talk about it every day, but this year, 2 million people across the border that have been caught, which tells us that there are many more than that, and the impact that that's having in terms of disruption. And then just all sorts of other cultural issues. We just earlier talked about the issue of race and racial tensions created by things like some of these shootings, as well as the Project 1619 project, all those kinds of things all have put us in a situation where we aren't exactly on a war footing, to put it mildly. And then the final reason that Andrew Mikta comes up with is you have a lot of these internal pressures that are building between these societies. The Chinese and Russian societies, for example, the population trends and current projections paint a devastating picture. And we've talked about this before, and it's true not only for Russia and China, but it's true for Europe and even somewhat the United States. But take those two countries, they're facing sort of a demographic winter in which you do not have replacement population. Sure, you have 1 billion people in China, but you also have the fertility rate dropping, so they're reaching kind of the peak peak of their population, and now you're getting an older and older population. What's been happening in Europe for some time now is going to be happening in China. What has been happening in Russia almost 2 decades ago is now happening in China. So you're dealing with a country that is some ways could be on the decline, and that is certainly the case. He doesn't mention a couple of other economic issues, not the least of which is it's quite possible that China could go broke at the rate they're going because of the housing issues and some of the spending that has been done to make the country look rich and prosperous, when the reality is you've got a lot of empty buildings, a lot of housing collapse, and all sorts of other issues that are going to ultimately lead to its demise. So the point he's making is that it isn't necessarily out of a sense of strength that these countries might move, but maybe out of a sense of weakness that it doesn't get any better in the future, so it's sort of now or never. Now, the bottom line for that is let's just first of all bring some sanity to the conversation. It is not inevitable that the United States get involved in a military conflict either with Russia or China. But it is at least possible that both could happen, maybe even intentionally, simultaneously, to weaken the United States' ability to project force in those two particular theaters of engagement. And so that's why, if nothing else, really want to encourage you to be in prayer for those in leadership, our political leadership, our military leadership, the kind of set of circumstances that we find ourselves in, because we are living in a very scary time. I don't want to overplay that, but I also don't want to ignore that. And given the fact that, as we pointed out just a few minutes ago, the establishment media is not going to tell you too much about the human rights abuses in China, probably not going to talk about the incredible devastation that would take place if indeed China took over Taiwan and thus controlled a very significant portion of the chip manufacturing for the world in terms of computer chips and those kinds of things, as well as China already projecting its force and influence in places to get rare earths and all sorts of other things. China is certainly looking dangerous, and we sometimes don't get a whole lot of stories about that. That's why we want to continue to talk about this here on Point of View. As we go to a break, as again, you probably are saying, I'm hearing some things on Point of View I hear nowhere else. And if that's the case, and you think it would be worth your financial support, let me encourage you to click on that button that says donate and to support this ministry, because we certainly do need your financial support to do so. And let me, as I've said before, help you understand that as we come to year end, this is a good time to think about what you might do to support other very important, worthwhile ministries. Tomorrow, for example, we have Gary Bauer on. We have Kelly Shackelford. These are two organizations that we featured in the past that are worthy of your support. Last week, we talked with Jim Dennison, for example, and John Stone Street. We want to highlight some key organizations, and of course, you know your local church needs financial support, the local radio station that carries this. So be generous and consider what you might do as we come to year end, not only to support Point of View, but to support some of these other organizations we like to highlight, because they're worthy of your financial support as well. And you've heard me say before, I'm not asking you to do something I don't do. My wife and I write checks to many of those organizations as well, because we believe in them and think you should as well. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Sometimes the daily news is flat out confusing, depressing. In fact, it's dark. In the chaos, Americans are searching for a light. They want the unfiltered truth in language they can understand. The psalmist pointed us to the answer. He said, "For it is you, God, who lights my lamp. The Lord, my God, lightens my darkness." At Point of View, we carry the torch of God's truth every day. With the Bible as our guiding light, we help listeners navigate the confusing time in which we live. And when you give generously, you are like a beacon of light for people searching for sound, credible truth. And now, it's up to you. December 31st is our deadline for the incredible matching challenge of $85,000. Your gift today has twice the impact. Everyone needs the light. Please give generously on or before December 31st at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. That's 800-347-5151 or online at pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. As I mentioned before, tomorrow we're going to really have a great lineup. We're going to have Kelly Shackelford. And, of course, one of the things we talked about with him was a very important case before the Supreme Court having to do with school choice. A very interesting article came out the other day. I didn't think I'd post it, but it was railing about the idea that it's almost unconscionable they could believe that we actually would provide funding for religious school. Heaven forbid, as if that hasn't happened before. As I've said before, those individuals coming back from World War II on the GI Bill, didn't matter whether or not they used the GI Bill to go to University of Texas or to go to Yale University or to go to Princeton University, go to the University of California at Berkeley, or to go to Georgetown University, which is ostensibly a Catholic school, or Notre Dame, which is a Catholic school, or Baylor, which was a Baptist school. I mean, we recognized that that was the choice of the individual. But now we have so changed this, and as a matter of fact, our next booklet coming out is on the issue of church-state, because I just think it's about time to give you some intellectual ammunition to answer that. But nevertheless, there's just people that just can't believe that it's quite possible the Supreme Court's going to say, this one family, if they wanted to spend that stipend that you provide to them, that voucher in a Christian school, that's okay. And so we'll see where that goes. And it brings me to another case before the Supreme Court, which will be argued in about a week. We probably won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but it relates to you even more. I know some of you may send your kids to a Christian school, but all of us find ourselves right now under the watchful eyes of the government because of enhanced surveillance. I'm holding up my booklet that we still make available to you, and I'm certainly going to update that pretty soon, entitled Privacy and Surveillance. But the booklet was really a lot more about the issues of how this had been used through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or the FISA Act, to actually spy on first candidate Donald Trump, then President Donald Trump. And my argument always has been, if you can spy on the President of the United States, you can spy on anybody. But there's another aspect of this that is probably more relevant, and that is that every day you're being watched digitally. And that's the argument being put forward right now in a very important case before the Supreme Court. Now, the case, as I mentioned, I think yesterday, it's pretty straightforward. The man's guilty. Nobody doubts that, okay? But nevertheless, this individual was actually able to be caught through various cell site locations, and you can use triangulation. That's the case. And then they could go back and backtrace his movements. And so the issue really isn't whether he's guilty, because he is, but it's how the information was gathered. And we have a Fourth Amendment that says that if indeed you are going to, if you will, spy on somebody, snoop on somebody, digitally monitor somebody, you need a warrant. And that wasn't the case. And so the case that is being brought right now isn't about his guilt or innocence, but about the method used to obtain that and the long-term implications for you and me. The head of the Rutherford Institute is John Whitehead. He's been on the program with us many times before. Maybe we'll get him on to talk about this case, maybe after it's decided. But nevertheless, the brief that they file is raising a very good question. Because every single day you're being watched digitally, and it doesn't matter whether you're an innocent citizen, whether you're a suspect, or whether you're a criminal, because the implication is we can use this technology and we don't have to get a warrant to intrude on your privacy. Now, it's one thing for you to give up your privacy when you go on, for example, Google. If you ever took the time to read all of the things that are placed there, it allows them to basically use you. As I said before, if you go online and it is free, then you're the product, because they're going to sell information about you. And you have probably figured out that when you go and make selections from Amazon or Google or anything else, maybe you wanted to buy a particular kind of iPod or iPhone or particular set of CDs or whatever it might be, a camera, even a vacuum cleaner. Guess what? All of a sudden, these ads start popping up, and it's very obvious that they know what you're doing. Well, you actually voluntarily, in a sense, entered into that and gave that up. But now the issue is that we can use this technology to monitor you in ways we never could before. We can tell if you're at home. We can tell if you're at church. We can tell if you're at a store. We can tell if you're at a political event. Now, the standard response, which is why I call this booklet Privacy and Surveillance, is, well, I have nothing to hide. Yeah, but you're making a distinction between privacy and secrecy. If you want to understand what that looks like, go to communist China, where then all of a sudden you go to the wrong political event. Have we already noticed that? Look at the cell phone records that have been collected from people that were in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Even if they were not at the rally, even if they were not at the Capitol, even if they were there engaged in completely honest and innocent business, their cell phone records were collected, and many of them had to give an account for why they were in Washington, D.C. that day. Well, the issue is pretty quickly becoming one in which we have this digital dragnet that is just collecting all of this information, and the implication is pretty concerning. And so that's what John Whitehead says, that basically cell phones have become de facto snitches, offering up, he says, a steady stream of digital locations on users' movements and travels. It also allows us to take all sorts of information from police who are tracking people's movements by way of license plate toll readers, scouring various social media posts, triangulating data from cell phone towers and Wi-Fi signals. Then on top of this, they're starting to layer into that facial recognition software, even cross-referencing footage from public social media posts. And if your goal is to catch a criminal, well, that's great. If your goal is to catch a terrorist, that's great. But we're all getting swept up in the same kind of digital data dragnet, and it doesn't distinguish between those who are innocent of wrongdoing or people that are suspects of a crime or even hardened criminals, and we're supposed to be protected by the Fourth Amendment. So I just thought that it would be important to maybe mention this case once again, because it is one that has surfaced quite a bit lately, and it is one that I will have a commentary coming out next week. While I'm mentioning that, next week, you also have a commentary coming out about student loan debt, because if you noticed, the president decided, guess what? If you owe money on a student loan, well, we're going to simply put that on pause once again. And so I mentioned the other day, and I've got this in a commentary for next week, when Charles Cook uses the idea of, I had a friend that was 18 years of age. He was forced to take out a $17,000 student loan, forced to go to college, and then complained about having to pay it back. Of course, he's being kidding, of course, but the point he's making is the way these people are making a demand for the fact that you should forgive the loan, right now it's in pause, is because, well, after all, we should be not forced to pay out our loans, because that would then give us money to spend on consumer products, and that would be beneficial to the economy. Of course, another one, if I didn't have to repay my loans, I could get on the property ladder. And I love his way of illustrating this. He said, well, you can use that both ways. You could say, if I didn't have to pay my mortgage, I'd have more money to spend on consumer products, and that would have a benefit to the economy. Or if the plumber didn't have to make payments on his Ford F-150, he uses to transport his equipment, he'd have more money to spend, maybe even to buy a home. And so the argument always, when you start that line of counter argument, is, well, student loans are different because, after all, we're benefiting society. Well, are they really different? I mean, think about this. Yes, it is a beneficial opportunity for you, and maybe even for the society, to have educated people. We understand that. But isn't there also a benefit for the plumber? benefit for anybody else that lives in this world. As a matter of fact, I think you could make the case, I'm going to sound like Dirty Jobs now, but I honestly do believe that society probably benefits more from some of these working people than from the people that go to college. And why should you force the people that are working and didn't go to college to pay for your college that you were able to get for free? So it's something to think about. And again, I thought since it's in the news and since this president is convinced that we're going to put another pause on paying back your student loan, which again, I think he doesn't have the constitutional authority to do so. That's why I've got a commentary coming out next week on that as well. I'm sure there's some that say, well, I just want you to forgive my loan. Yeah, I'd like you to forgive some of the housing loans that I've had to spend time on, or even some of my college loans, but that's not how the world works. Let's take a break. We've got more to cover right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. You know, one of the things we talk about here on Point of View is the issue of critical thinking. And I thought I might just real quickly talk about two ways in which you can be on alert for ways in which people are trying to manipulate your emotions and maybe trying to, in one way or another, use logical fallacies or confuse thinking. One of those I've mentioned before and that is what we talked about with our good friend Greg Kokel. He was on the radio program, and we mentioned at the time what was called the Kafka trap. Now, if you get his book, he actually does spend some time on the tactics getting into it, but again, it's pretty simple, and we've seen this a lot being used. A classic illustration is if a social justice warrior says, when you say you're not a racist, that just proves you're a racist. And so it's a linguistic kind of arm-twisting technique. And I want you to think through this. Now, the reason it's called the Kafka trap is because in his novel, The Trial, Kafka presents a totalitarian world in which a man is arrested and accused of a crime. When he protests that he is not guilty of a crime, the state argues that the claims to innocence proves that he is guilty. Now, you've seen this before. If you admit to being a racist, you're a racist. If you deny being a racist, well, you're also a racist. You're a racist either way is kind of a classic example of what's called the Kafka trap. And so, in some respects, the thought police in our society have really rigged the game. It's a heads I win, tails you lose debate technique. Now, Greg Kokel, first of all, recognizes that attempting to banter with somebody who seriously believes this might not be very effective. But he also recognizes that you maybe start by at least trying to see if offering counter evidence is always the case of an individual being guilty. If they buy that argument in any situation, then you have some difficulty there. But you might turn it back on them and say, well, you might say, do you know what social justice means? Person will say, well, of course I do. Well, then you can say, well, that proves you don't, because you don't really understand social justice, because people who say they understand social justice really don't understand social justice. It's kind of a linguistic trick. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but sometimes you have to recognize that this game is being played, and it's a rigged game indeed. And that is what is called the Kafka trap. Now, the flip side of that is something that I am going to be writing about in the future. And I think I mentioned it briefly, but it's worth coming back to, because in this whole world of critical thinking, we are going to need to really think through some issues. And one of those that surfaced the other day, and I mentioned it just in passing, and maybe we will have a commentary about it that you can read, is simply this idea of what Kevin Williamson talked about as the one-arm paper hanger argument. Now, I've never heard it called that, but you probably have run into it if you've ever read some of these op-eds, some of these news stories, because what he was at the time critiquing was a writer who said that we should not consider adoption as a viable option to abortion because, after all, I was adopted. I know the trauma it can inflict. Now, if you read the article in the New York Times, and you're welcome to do so, she really didn't experience any trauma. Matter of fact, she points out that she had a really good upbringing, but she had heard that there was some trauma to her biological mother. So the argument goes something like this. I've had an experience, so that makes me an expert. I've had cancer, so here is what I think about healthcare reform. Or another example, I am the parent of a child who died in a school shooting. Here's what I think about gun control. Now, let's just think those through from a logical point of view. Having cancer doesn't necessarily give you any special knowledge about the policy positions, even the economic realities of healthcare insurance, healthcare subsidies, hospital procedures. Because after all, let's face it, healthy people and sick people have a variety of different opinions about healthcare. Being sick certainly provides an emotional appeal, but it doesn't provide more intellectual weight to the argument. It might help you understand a little bit more about how you were treated as a patient or something of that nature. But just because you have cancer doesn't make you an expert on healthcare policy. We kind of figured that out. And what is so interesting is he also turns it around and says, notice how this argument never is used the other way. For example, I'm the parent of a child who died in a school shooting. Here's why I support the Second Amendment. Because it always goes one way. It's always to use, and used by the media, used by various commentators to actually promote a liberal agenda. Now, there's also the reverse of that to watch out for. I mean, that's where it looks like you're acting against your best interest, and so that makes you a more enlightened, experienced commentator. For example, I'm a millionaire, but I believe that rich guys need to pay higher taxes. And this one sometimes is seen as more legitimate because I'm actually acting against my own interest. And right now, you might even see some of these emails coming up from patriotic millionaires. Again, it's an emotional appeal, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your particular view has more weight than anyone else. It's interesting that you find yourself in a world in which you perhaps are convinced that taxes need to go up. By the way, if you use that example, lots of times we've said to these patriotic millionaires and others, well, there's nothing keeping you from paying more taxes. Elon Musk said he's going to pay, $11 billion in taxes. Nothing to keep Elon Musk from paying $12 billion. Okay. As a matter of fact, you could use that as a separate gift, a check or whatever, to pay down the national debt. So, there's nothing keeping you from doing that, because the implication here is that even though I want my taxes to go up, I want your taxes to go up too. And by the way, if I could jump in for just a second, because that's beyond this argument, it is that sometimes when wealthy people make these arguments, they know it really won't affect them because they have tax lawyers, they have loopholes and everything. So it looks like great virtue signaling, but it really isn't the case. But anyway, one of the things I want to do more and more this year, we've done a fair amount of it in 2021, but expect more in 2022, is to really help us all with critical thinking. I think we're going to face more with this cancel culture, more with logical fallacies, more with all this confused thinking. We as Christians are going to have to think more deeply and more effectively about how to answer some of these questions. And so our goal here at Point of View is really to equip you to be able to think biblically about these issues, to have discernment, to have courage, and make a difference. In other words, we want you to be able to light some lamps. And if you go to our website, you'll see one candle, then another candle, then another candle, then another candle, then another candle. And we're convinced that if we can just light a few candles and we can light some other candles, many of you probably went to a candlelight service, you could turn off the lights inside the church, and the candles alone would have lit the dark room. And so we want you to be able to light some candles, and we want to be as effective as we can to pass on some of the things that we've learned by interviewing these guests, by reading some of these various articles, so that you can think biblically and critically about these issues, because we're going to need discernment more than ever in 2022. That's why we, without hesitation, encourage you to visit the website, which is pointofview.net, and click on that button that says donate. Or some of you might say, I really don't want to call when you're on the show, but I might like to talk to someone off air. And you can certainly do that. Even though we're going off the air in just about 30 seconds, you can give us a call at this number, 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. One of our staff would love to chat with you. And if you would like to make a gift, you certainly can do so. Put it on your credit card. And again, the match is on the table at the moment until it expires. And so again, it's a dollar for dollar match. A gift of $50 becomes $100. Again, want to thank everybody, including Doug and Ivy, for helping us today. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
At Point of View, we are already thinking about our New Year's resolution to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. But we can't accomplish that without your support. And right now, your support is especially critical, because whatever you give now through December 31st will be doubled up to $85,000. That means all gifts, whether $10 or $1,000, doubled through December 31st. Did you know Point of View is 100% listener supported? And it's more than just a radio show. Thanks to your support, we offer free tools to help Americans build a Christian worldview in their own lives and live it out in practical ways. Don't miss this opportunity to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. Give by December 31st to have twice the impact. To give today, visit pointofview.net. or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.